If you follow the show closely, again, recently we've been talking about the intricacy of the politics. Again, we're looking at a newly elected prime minister in the nation of Japan and also to the government shutdown in America. The question you want to ask is, what is the future for the politics and regarding the nations across the spectrum? How much can the citizens around the world today can trust the governments? Now, before we answer that question, we still need to circle back what is one of the most fundamental aspects that people are so concerned today is the word economy. Put it simple, money. How do we know that today we still can trust this financial structure? And what about some of the words? It's called a digital sovereignty or even data colonialism. Those words are not far from what we are talking about today, especially when we look at the finance and also the future of the financial situation. Well, today in this episode, we are going to answer all the questions. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. He focuses on international law, international relations, and Brazil, and he's currently a visiting professor of international law and international relations at China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, China. Well, Dr. Marcus, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, again, Dr. Marcus, it's fascinating that today we look at the political polarization, but on the minds of everyone is still about the word economy. I want to dive into the article that you recently published. It's called Digital Sovereignty and the Data Colonialism, Shaping a Just the Digital Order for the Global South. Now, before we talk about the nation's countless Global South, I think it's crucial that we need to understand some of the definitions of the words that you put in the article. For example, Dr. Marcus, how do we understand digital sovereignty at this moment? And also, what is the relationship between the phrase and lead to data colonialism? Your thoughts?
I have been very concerned with the fact that we produce so much knowledge nowadays, and we volunteer that knowledge to companies that manage, that actually take our knowledge by giving us the opportunity to have a presence or life in social media, for instance. And they say that it's for free, right? This exchange, that they give us a platform for us to interact with the people that we know. And on the other hand, we provide the whole, all the information that we have available. Now, it is not a very fair situation, and it's not a very fair equation. Now, what is the challenge and what is the problem? You do see that the majority of those companies are based in the North, in what we call the global North. And you do not see that kind of development taking place in the global South. Now, what is the problem here is that all of a sudden, the South is producing all this amount of knowledge, which is given for free to these companies in the North to sell products to the South again. So it's basically what we call, and that's basically what colonialism was in the past. I come from Brazil. Latin America was, we were, Portuguese, Spanish colony for a long time, and that's what happened. We would provide the basic materials and buy the refined products back. So what we say is that at the same time in which countries had to declare their independence and break this tie, this relationship that was very onerous to the colonies, the same thing is taking place now, in which the global South, or the majority of the countries, is basically providing access to a very wealthy pool of information without getting any reward, and actually buying back the information. So we need to find out a way or to balance this equation or somehow, develop our own mechanism to ensure that, we are not on in this process, we're not being exploited like the global south was a long time ago, was not a long time ago, but was for quite some time.
Dr. Marcus, when we talk about the modern day economy, again, we're looking at a variety of financial structures or what we say monetary structures. Like, for example, we look at the West, we have what we call capitalism. And then we look at other countries in Europe, they're running on the system as authoritarianism, or of course in China, in many other countries, the financial structures are very much different. But if I may to borrow one of the well-known politicians in the US, I'm sure you know his name, Bernie Sanders, the independent senator for Vermont. And he has been one of the strong critic for what he called the rich people or the top 1%, who almost owns the whole world. Again, I'm now putting the names up there. But the question to you, Dr. Marcus, is when we look at what Bernie Sanders' so-called top 1% or this financial elites, how do you think their financial behaviors or their financial interest actually bring a lot of noises to what we are seeing today? So in other words, some people complain that the gap between the middle class and the lower class is getting wider. And also we're looking at some of the countries are getting more attractive because of the infrastructure, because of the politics or whatever the reason you think about it. But at the end of the day, how do we understand the existence of those people? And why do you think people like Bernie Sanders are so concerned about this economic gap or this financial gap? What is the motivation or what is the message behind that?
Well, the problem, I think, and in the whole process is that even though we realize that having power is different from having money, the problem is this association between power and money, in which you start seeing that the whole system starts operating to benefit the few, not the majority. And that is one lesson, for instance, that you learn in China, right? Business is different from government, right? They are separated, and there are areas in which they talk to each other, but they're separated because you realize the business is also an instrument for the wealth and for the state in the process. So the challenge that you do see is that this 1% that Bernie Sanders refers to, which is, if you think about, we have 8 billion people, but only 1,000 billionaires. What happens is that the whole system starts working for them. And the challenge is that instead of fomenting more competition, which has always been the big thing about capitalism, right? You realize that we are ending up in the hands of very few. And if you look, for instance, into artificial intelligence, the greatest fear I have is if we end up with only 2 companies providing that kind of service. Or social media, you see that happening. And wherever you go, you realize that these companies are getting so much power. And then they start, framing the whole environment, the whole ecosystem just to benefit them. And that's why I agree. And in the sense that we're not against wealth. Wealth is good. Wealth is good, and you have people that have to be rewarded for generating wealth. But the problem is that when this wealth starts feeding on itself and creating like a whole ecosystem that only benefits the ones that are inside, and you're not fomenting or stimulating others to come along. And that's the big challenge that we see. And I agree in the sense that, of course, if you're at the top, you want to control the system, but you cannot do that with 8 billion people, right?
Dr. Marcus, I want to dive into your article. Again, this is another phrase or another term that fascinates me. It's called surveillance capitalism. Interestingly speaking, that back in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, I believe there was a book also called Surveillance Capitalism. But I want to dive into your article. This is what you wrote, and I quote: "The term surveillance capitalism encapsulates this dynamic, a business model pioneered by corporations like Google, Meta, Amazon, which accumulates the so-called behavioral surplus, the exhaustive data trails of our daily lives." End quote. Now, I am not a scientist and I'm not a psychologist. And I shouldn't even dare to say I understand the existence of the human behavior. But one thing that Dr. Marcus put in a simple way that we understand, when we look at the business model presented by Google, Meta, Amazon, can I just say that those companies or those tech companies, they pay so much attention to human behaviors because one way it could generate wealth and you could generate interest or link to the wealth, but they don't really care about how we feel, or they don't really care about how humans react to the algorithm or to those tech companies. Is it fair to say that? So in other words, why is this so crucial to understand the surveillance capitalism when we talk about the finance or the financial structures today?
Let me take it to the political side, and we'll go back to this aspect that you raised. You might recall that Trump was banned from social media.
That's right.
Right? And you will recall also that an interesting factor is that the algorithm starts creating a bubble in which you live. And the problem is that when you're inside of that bubble, you start getting fed with information that you want. You start only seeing things that correspond to your algorithm. And then you start isolating yourself and belonging to a certain different tribe. And it's not that we don't do that in our lives, but the problem is that we're doing that digitally, and you start getting fed with information that only caters to your taste or to the algorithm that you have created by looking into certain things. I was surprised to see, I was talking to some people some time ago about this. And for instance, we all like to take selfies, right? We love taking selfies. But one of the technical guys that I spoke to, he said, the camera is not really for selfies. The camera is to check out how much time you spend in each place that you go. So it builds the algorithm based on the time that you spend looking into certain things in your phone. So we're constantly being surveilled to find what our needs are. And this can be a problem because depending on who is behind, we can go into certain areas and into certain platforms and influence certain situations. You see, Donald Trump was removed from social media platforms. He created his own, right? So what you see is that you can have that influence politically, and you can also favor some businesses. It's a very interesting thing for you to notice that, if somebody writes something against you, you can actually pay Google or, start using the tools available so that anything that is against you goes into other pages, not in the front ones. So there are things that are complicated in the sense that, okay, we have an enormous source of information, but we're being fed with crumbs of information that are predetermined based on the algorithm that has been built. And certainly, many of these algorithms will influence us politically, economically, and even our lifestyle. You see the number of people that get depressed by watching others on social media. So you realize that all these things can play with the human mind, and certainly you are providing all this information for free. just to have your name in a platform. And that's the challenge we see. It has made many things available, right? YouTube and all these things that are very positive, but in a way, somehow it's a give and take. But you realize that the take is much more than the give.
Dr. Marcus, again, there's no denying that we know humans are tribalism. So, in other words, since the day, we can trace it all the way back to the Stone Age and look at what's happening right now. Again, either we belong to social groups or political, not groups, but organizations, or, again, humans tend to belong to certain groups because we share the same message, we speak the same language. But going back to what you just said, look at again, part of the title of your article is digital sovereignty. So do you think that today, when we put our interest in the finance, when we put our interest in the economy, right now people gradually are shifting their interest from offline to online? So in other words, I am not shopping in the stores anymore, but instead I'm shopping online. I'm looking at the country's economic projection, not by what people are selling locally, but I want to see how well they're building their business online. Or even perhaps that, again, going back to people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, all those famous names from all the big businesses, they might not be interested in domestic or local businesses, but they're interested how can they grab the attention from the online world. Do you think this change or this shift are able to shoulder the responsibilities or the interest of the citizens today? What do you think of that?
Well, I think that you realize that many things can be done online, and I'm not going against the online world. And I'm not being negative about it. I'm just saying that you need to have the capacity, and countries should. Of course, there are many countries that will not have the capacity to do this.
Right.
So we need to find ways of somehow helping them have some freedom in that sense. Now, the problem, it's not that we live in tribes. We all live in tribes, right? We have our nationalities, we have our cities, we have our governments, and we have everything in that sense. But the problem is the bubbles that are getting created. And that bubble influences many of the decisions that people make. For instance, I always say this to my students. If you read social media today, or if you read the newspapers in the West, you will see that all of them are very negative about China. And it generates this image that doesn't correspond to the reality. But once you start getting fed with the algorithm, that's all you're going to see. That's all you're going, and the problem is that you will get fed with this information and you're never going to get out of the bubble. And that's the challenge, I think. And it can happen and it can affect in many of the decisions that we make, because we are highly influenced by the things that we see, the things that we hear. And we talk a lot about fake news and the difficulty that it is to control what is true and what is not. And now with artificial intelligence behind, you can actually see people saying things that are not even the person that mentioned that. So in one sense, there's a lot of advantages that we have on technology. It causes major displacement of jobs too, which will force governments also to rethink on how to get the population employed and how to create new jobs, how to create disruptive sectors. But the challenge is this. Okay, we understand the good. Now, the problem is when the bad starts generating even worse situations.
Dr. Marcus, I have two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about another major portion of your article. It's what you entitled Political and Governance Asymmetry. If I can borrow a cliche that once said by, I think, one of the well-known philosophers, The phrase goes as, if you pray for the rain and you have to also deal with the mud. I remember back in the days that when we think about the economic interest, a couple years ago, people tend to say, I'm only interested in economy, not politics. But today, we're looking at the situation that you cannot deal with economy without understanding the politics. But today, when we look at in the global south, look at those nations and the crucial regions, I am so puzzled about the word asymmetry. So, Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, why are we seeing political and governance asymmetry? And what does that say about the complication of those two?
The issue, Will, is that the richer are getting richer and the poorer are getting poorer. And the greatest challenge, and I recall this, when the internet started, one of the major questions that we had at the time was the problem of the haves and the have-nots. Now, you do realize that internet access that we have widely available in many places around the world is not the reality in other places. And what you see is that the gap is growing even more. Now, it's an interesting thing to think that, on climate, we have been thinking about carbon credits so we can transfer wealth from the rich countries to the poor countries so that they can develop. We're not doing this with data, right? And we're not stimulating countries to create their own environments and create their own technologies and have that improvement in creating disruptive technologies. So if you look into what happened in China, for instance, China has become the largest, I think, as far as I know, the largest exporter of electric vehicles. Now, it is a disruptive sector. The Chinese had the chance to deepen and to improve the quality and all this. But this is not going to happen in all the countries in the global south. Why? Because none of them are like China, do not have the same circumstances and the same endowments that China has. So that is the challenge you see. And this affects the whole thing. And the whole issue is this. In the long run, we are looking into a few things that should be concerns for us. Unemployment, right? Unemployment will lead to social instability. Social instability will generate economic instability. And that's something that people in the past, and as you said, like to separate economics from politics, but we realize nowadays more and more how closely associated they are. You see, it's been a politician that has created this major diversion in international trade. There you go. You see, politics affecting the economic.
That's right, Dr. Marcus. Now, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, last portion of your article, you mentioned about Middle East. And as a matter of fact, you used the three words, ambition, wealth, and vulnerability. I think previously that you and we discussed the generosity or the wealth in the Middle East. And we surely understand the word ambition. But I'm very much interested to talk about the vulnerability that along with the Middle East. So Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, briefly, why is it important and significant for us to understand the vulnerability within the Middle East when we look at the entire picture for the global economy? And also, why do you think it's crucial that we understand the vulnerability so that we can find capabilities or we can find effective methodologies to tackle the issues? Your final thoughts.
You realize that sometimes having money doesn't mean that you have access to technology. And this is an issue, right? And what you see in the Middle East is that they have lots of money and they're trying to change the nature of their countries in the sense of not being so dependent on oil. It's a difficult transition because, oil is a very tempting thing, right? If you have a tree of money that grows every day, why are you going to do something else? And that's always a big challenge, and that's why we call the resource curse that happens. Now, the problem is that not having money but not having technology will generate vulnerabilities. And you see this, for instance, when you look into the region and you say, okay, which country is the most advanced technologically in the Middle East? And it's Israel. And there is no doubt about it, right? That Israel is the most developed technologically. And you have seen that with technology, they were able to do the situation that they had with pagers and in Lebanon. You saw that how quickly they were able to dominate the situation in Iran. So you say, and Israel is not the wealthiest country in the region. So you realize here that having money is not necessarily going to be what solves the situation. You need to invest a lot in human capital, intellectual capital, so that you can overcome the vulnerability that technology can create. And of course, the more technology you have, the more power. And eventually you will see, and that's something that always happens, this money moving from the places where you have the money, but you may not have the brains. And usually the money eventually will follow the brains.
Well, again, Dr. Marcus, it's fascinating to understand. Again, it's not just about the concept and the phrases that you put in this article, but it really shows the projection and also the hope that we understand. We're hoping that this global economy can really go to the path or really land on the path that you're showing or you're demonstrating. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Vinicius de Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. He focuses on international law and international relations. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out this amazing article, which is entitled Digital Sovereignty and Data Colonialism, Shaping a Just Digital Order for the Global South. Well, Dr. Marcus, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to explore this global South. So thank you so much for doing this.